Welcome to the third of the 5 videos that have been developed in a collaboration between the University of Melbourne and the Victorian Department for Education and Training to address numeracy learning difficulties and specifically dyscalculia. This video focuses on dyscalculia as a specific maths learning deficit. As discussed in video 1, there are many different forms of MLD, including delayed number competence. Dyscalculia is considered to be a neurological deficit affecting number sense or number knowledge that results in an inability to connect number symbols and words with non-symbolic forms of number and with the spatial aspects of number. Now, numbers are everywhere in our environment, and this is important in 2 ways. They're everywhere in that they can cause someone with dyscalculia to be put off by them, but they're also everywhere so that we can use them to assist dyscalculic students and children to access numbers more often within their environment, and I'll raise that later. So, for example, you might be asked this sort of question: how much more is the basketball and the soccer ball? It's in newspapers, in the advertisement section, in reductions on objects that are for sale in shops, on cafe menus, road signs, and other sorts of fast food menus. So numbers are everywhere for us to access and to manipulate. Now, what is dyscalculia? And I've talked in earlier videos that it's hard to define. So I'm going to use this Department for Education and Skills definition from the UK because it characterises dyscalculia very much in the same way as we would regard it, as a condition that affects the ability to acquire arithmetical skills. Dyscalculic learners may have difficulty understanding simple number concepts, lack an intuitive grasp of numbers, and have problems learning number facts and procedures. Even if they produce a correct answer or use a correct method, they may do so mechanically and without confidence. The impact of dyscalculia is covered in an All in the Mind program, which I'll talk about later, but the link is there if you're interested in listening to this program, which characterises dyscalculia and describes its forms and the impact it has on people's lives. Now, in the first video, I introduced this concept, does maths matter? And I talked about the way in which it impacts young people, that is school children and school students. But now we're going to look at some of the other impacts for adult life. And so students with dyscalculia are at risk of early school leaving, low participation in post-school education and training, poor employment outcomes, and also social isolation. And this was part of a study by Parsons and Biller. And they showed as well from their data that numeracy problems impact more negatively on job prospects than do literacy problems. And in the order of 4 times as many of their participants were in the very low numeracy category compared to the very low literacy category. 27% versus 7% for women and 19% versus 5% for men. So what are the consequences of dyscalculia for adults? Well, they can be blocked from certain professions. There are some professions for which number knowledge is going to be critical, accountancy, for example. But more importantly, it can have an impact on just everyday life. The numbers of times that we need to compare statistics. So, for instance, if we want to make some decisions about which interest rate we're going to lock in for our mortgages, or how we're going to organize our superannuation, all of those number competencies come into our decision making as adults. Difficulty managing money is a major issue. There is some evidence that this difficulty managing money and feeling embarrassed about it can cause some people to prefer to shoplift rather than be embarrassed at the till about not knowing how much to pay or how much change they're going to get. And in video 1, we've talked about low self-esteem, anxiety and avoidance in school students, but it also extends into adults as well. So these are some of the things adults say. I've always had difficulty with simple addition and subtraction since young. Always still have to count on my fingers quickly. For example, for 5 plus 7 without anyone knowing. Sometimes I feel very embarrassed, especially under pressure. I just panic. I struggled through school with maths to the point teachers gave up on me. I can only count on my fingers or with a calculator. I can't count out change no matter how small and often get flustered with any tasks involving numbers. Despite trying hard, I could never remember my times tables. Division just bewildered me totally. English was one of my best subjects at school. I have no trouble whatsoever reading or writing, understanding literary concepts and theories, but spend an hour sitting in the bank trying to work out how much money is in my check account. Last year, I returned to university, attempting to avoid any subjects containing mathematics, but hidden in nearly everything are formulas and calculations. So we're now going to look at 3 short videos that feature Brian Butterworth in a conversation with a student with dyscalculia, with the teacher of that student, and also with a businessman with a lifetime lived experience of dyscalculia.
Very long playground.
You like it here?
Yeah. The only bit that I don't like is maths. Definitely not maths.
Professor Butterworth, what you do like very, very much.
I do like science and history.
No, other thing that's your favourite thing. Tell me about that.
Dinosaurs.
You like dinosaurs?
Yeah, I especially love dinosaurs. There's a type of pachycephalosaur
Yeah.
called Dracorex, and its name means Dragon King. And amazingly, all dinosaurs can link their family tree back to a very small insect-eating lizard. There are no mammals in the age of the dinosaurs except
So
for these.
I would like you to fill in the number that is missing. So what have we got here?
27,
7 plus something equals,
30,
yes, now 27 plus,
3.
right. Now the next one,
He's just written down 2 as being what you need to add to 8 to make 30. And now his teacher is asking him to build up 8 to 30 using rods and unit cubes, white unit cubes. And you can see he's having trouble doing
now
that.
what are you going to add?
He really doesn't
2.
have much confidence or much skill in putting out the right number. So it really takes quite a lot of encouragement and hints from the teacher for him to get this right.
Nah.
how many are you short of?
Kazaa.
So I'd just like to raise a couple of points from that video. The first relates to the opening comments by the student. The one thing I really dislike is maths. That is actually why I am where I am today. I was a school principal and I was interviewing students coming into year 7, and I would always ask them what they particularly liked about school, and they would answer art or history or what goes on in the yard at recess time. And then I would say, is there anything that you don't like about school? And almost invariably the answer maths would come up. And I found this quite concerning as a long-term maths teacher, that so many of the students coming into the school disliked maths. The other point that I'd like to make about this is how obviously intelligent this boy is. Often we associate maths learning difficulties with a perception that the student isn't intelligent. But you could see he had a perfectly good memory. He had a memory for all sorts of details about dinosaurs. He obviously also liked history and science. So his maths number difficulty was very specific and very obvious when he was doing quite a simple question and having such difficulty. His teacher now talks.
So the really important thing is to establish what the concept is, and this can be terribly slow. And you've got to, well, the way we teach in England, you have confusion between cardinal and ordinal in numbers. They're taught both from the word go. And so if children can count to say 5, they don't understand that the quantity of 5 includes 1, 2, 3, and 4. They simply think it's the 5th one. And so you need to work with concrete materials and then move from the concrete to pictorial and written only once they're able to do it with the concrete materials and really understand what they're doing. And it's vitally important that the student talks, because they need to reason through. I think you saw it with the children we were filming, that when they start to reason through, they can unscramble some of this.
So 2 important points from those comments: the use of concrete materials for as long as possible while students instantiate their conceptual understanding of number is emphasized, but also the need to listen to students as they problem solve. That is exactly the strategy we're going to raise in the intervention video 5. This need for the student to work through the problem and articulate the way that they are working through the problem so that we understand what it is they don't understand. Now, this last video is a businessman with a lived experience of
I was
dyscalculia.
completely useless at maths. I just couldn't do it, and my teachers couldn't understand how I was very good at all the other subjects but couldn't do maths. And they thought I was deliberately stupid or lazy or something similar. There have been so many problems which you can't admit. I couldn't admit, as I was fairly successful, that I couldn't count. So I kept it hidden till I was, 55, and then I came out, as it were, because of you, Brian. And it took me such a long time to understand and deal with this issue. I know it's real. I have had dyscalculia my whole life. It's not some American fad. I know, because there are so many aspects of my life, even counting with my fingers under a table at a board meeting, when you're raising millions of pounds. I've done that. I know what a real impediment it is, and that's why I think it's so important to recognize what it is and what you can do to cope with it. And that's why it's so important, I think, your work is that you're saying, look, these children are not stupid. They have a specific problem which they can be identified, and there are coping mechanisms. There's no cure, but there are coping mechanisms, and I think, a living embodiment of that. There's many things I've done, but I'm still, by the way, I'm still a lousy businessman. I do lots of things and I achieve a lot. I don't make much money.
So what is it about maths then? Maths is componential. We've talked about this in the past. It is different parts of maths add together to give you a comprehensive understanding of number. And this starts in the non-verbal area. So in number, in terms of approximation and comparison, skills that newborns we have shown already have. And then we move from that into a verbal form of number. We have number facts, we move into the operations of addition, multiplication. Then we move into a logical realm where we're looking at problem solving and higher maths. And they might look like this algebra equation to solve or a word problem to solve. And another aspect of number is the spatial aspect that's been mentioned in earlier videos when talking about number line estimation, and it can include geometry and number line. Now, is it possible to explain developmental dyscalculia in relation to a cognitive model of normal or expected function? So is it just part of that continuum, or is it something completely different? Also, is there any evidence of independence in the establishment of these components, Or is it possible that some can be acquired in a different order or in a different capacity than others? And then, are there any limitations to functional plasticity in relation to dyscalculia? Now, what do I mean by functional plasticity? The brain is known to have this enormous capacity for plasticity, where new pathways can be built, new connections made, new networks created, so that new learning can occur. Now, the question is that possible in dyscalculia? If dyscalculia is a neurological deficit in the brain, is it possible for us to create new networks so that children and students with dyscalculia can make the same sort of progress as other students? And then, is there a single route to competence, or are there alternative pathways? So there are some big questions we have to ask with dyscalculia. And some of the experimental studies with maths learning difficulties that were run by Geary showed two basic functional or phenotypic numerical differences. And the first one was, it was the use of developmentally immature arithmetic procedures and a high frequency of procedural errors. And if you think back to video 2, where we talked about the development of counting, and we showed how immature strategies can be used to achieve the end, but it doesn't necessarily, it's not the most efficient, and it can lead to errors. So for many MLD children, this appears to be associated with developmental delay in acquiring conceptual knowledge underlying the procedural applications, even though other potential factors like working memory can't be ruled out of this. But this is a point that we'll raise several times, this issue of procedural application leading to conceptual knowledge. The second difference that Geary noticed was that this was a much more fundamental, that is to say, it doesn't disappear with development in number representation. And also it also included the ability to retrieve arithmetic facts from long-term memory. Now, the impact of this is a disruption of the ability to spatially represent numerical information, as in the number 9 that we've talked about earlier, and also visuospatial neurological deficit that affects both functional skills and conceptual understanding of number representation. Now, this is really important because one of the issues we find with dyscalculic students is we can teach them something and they seem to learn it and then they forget it. And this is usually because they have acquired some sort of a process or procedure, but they haven't conceptualized what underpins that procedure. So these are important deficits. So the two differences, though, distinguish between maths delay, as we talked about in the first slide of video 1, and maths deficit. And they underline this difference between maths learning difficulties more generally and dyscalculia specifically. So from a cognitive perspective, some lower order deficits of MLD students potentially reside in 5 component skills. There are procedural and memory retrieval. So these are applying particular procedures to problem solve and remembering number facts and operations along the way. And then we have these other components which are critical for making progress beyond the most basic number processing. Conceptual understanding is one of those. If you don't understand what the procedure is about or why it's there, then you are going to forget what the procedure is. And that requires your working memory. Your working memory is when you are solving problems and you have to hold numbers in your head and manipulate them. That is a feature of working memory. And of course, speed of processing is going to also affect this, because if you are slower in your speed of processing, then that process of working memory is going to be slow and you're going to forget things that you needed to recall in order to move forward. So we might divide these into 2 groups then. Functional skills are the top ones. They're evident in the process of solving arithmetic problems. So just procedural applications and remembering things. And then we have these other skills that might underlie and also contribute to the procedural or memory components. If you understand what the process is, you have a conceptual understanding of it, then you are much more likely to remember it next time you meet a problem like that. So what are the big questions then that we might ask with dyscalculia? Well, one question we might ask is what causes dyscalculia, and I'm hoping I'm going to be able to answer some of these questions through the course of this video and future videos. And what can educational neuroscience tell us about it? How can it be identified early? Can it be prevented? What is the best type of remediation? And are there subtypes? And if so, do they need different remediation approaches? Now, the last two of those questions are going to be answered, I hope, in the intervention video 5. And identified early, where I'm hoping we're going to be able to answer that in the video 4 when we're looking at assessment. And we have already mentioned in video 1 preschoolers' differences in understanding number. But we do need to know how maths works in the brain. Now, no video presentation would be complete without a picture of the brain. But I can assure you this is the only one, and it is quite simple to understand. Now, I talked earlier about this connection between the non-symbolic form of a number, the word, and the symbol, and how important that is. Now, that connection actually happens in the brain. So it is the coming together of different information in the brain from the visual cortex, from the memory, and what happens is that connection is made in an area of the brain known as the intraparietal sulcus. And the intraparietal sulcus is just here, just above your left ear. And it's a part of the brain that is responsible for integrating information in the brain. And how we know this is because it is more active when students are undergoing magnitude comparison tasks, where these sorts of bits of information are essential in order to answer to solve the task. And we also know that there is less grey matter, there's less brain activity in that intraparietal sulcus for dyscalculics. So it does look like this is the site of the neurological deficit in the brain, and it is this particular area which in dyscalculic children isn't functioning, and we need to address that by the way we intervene to try and avoid needing that particular connection by building new connections. And of course, I talked earlier about this issue of plasticity. The brain is very plastic. Can we form new networks? Can we make new connections so that these students can progress with their number understanding? Now, I need to just talk about dyslexia compared to dyscalculia. I talked earlier about the similar prevalence rates, although we are now looking as though, now that we're more accurate in diagnosing dyscalculia, it looks like it may be up as high as 12%. But there are two very different neurocognitive systems for literacy and numeracy. Different brain systems. I've just shown you the brain system for numeracy. It is quite different for literacy. Literacy is parasitic on language. That is to say, it's not an innate system for reading and spelling. So language is learned and reading and spelling are taught afterwards, but there isn't a part of the brain. And we talked earlier about the evolutionary advantage of number ability. There isn't a similar evolutionary advantage for being able to read and write. There are biological basic numerical capacities, and these seem to be innate as compared to dyslexia. And we've already shown that infants have quite well-defined numerical capacities right at birth. It is conceivable as well, given that there is a neurological deficit in dyscalculia, that there are different genetic bases for dyslexia and dyscalculia, although it is also, we do find it occurring together, but nevertheless, it also does occur separately. So it does look like there are different genetic bases. And then some of the questions we get asked, is dyscalculia just due to poor language abilities? If the students can't read the questions that they're being asked, is that what the problem is? Well, no, because when we compare dyscalculics with controls, we find that we have the same color naming response time. Is it a consequence of slow reading? No, reading disabled students with dyslexia are normal on maths tests, both in terms of accuracy and the time they take. Is dyscalculia a consequence of a reading disability like dyslexia? No, because the pattern of dyscalculia is the same in those that are pure dyscalculia and those that have, in addition, dyslexia. Is it a matter of low IQ? Well, you saw the video with the young lad from England working through maths. No, when you compare control groups, you find that there is no difference on IQ. Is it due to short-term memory problems? No, because again, when you compare with controls, you have exactly the same results. So, is it due to a deficit in basic numerical abilities? Yes, it is. It is a standalone issue of this deficit, and it is focused on number sense, pure number ability, and we find that those who are dyscalculic and those that are dyscalculic and dyslexic are worse on enumeration and number comparison. And from video 1, you will remember that those are the core number abilities which characterize our number sense. So what are the surface symptoms of dyscalculia then? Well, the first thing is a delay in counting. And this is, what we mean by this is when children are asked to start or end at a specific point. So if they're given this array and they say, count the animals ending with the mouse, they have extreme difficulty with this because they have learnt the procedure of counting going from left to right, and they find it very hard to count in any other order. The use of less sophisticated addition counting strategies, I've already talked about those, counting on and counting all, comparing those, and also that more advanced one starting with a larger number. So I've talked about this earlier, counting all, where you count all the numbers, counting on, where you start with the first addend, and then counting on max, where you start with the larger. But that does depend on knowing what the larger number is, which for dyscalculics is usually not the case. They also have trouble memorizing number facts. And we suggest that this is because of a lack of conceptual understanding. It's learning of tables is not simply reciting them. You do have to have some kind of conceptual picture of number to do it. And of course, difficulty with story problems, but that's especially when dyslexia is present. Now, some of the problems that have occurred, and you remember in the earlier video, I talked about the fact that we don't use cutoffs. And the reason we don't use cutoffs is characterized on this slide. You can see here that there are many tests for maths learning disabilities and for dyscalculia. But you can also see that the criterion that is set for being dyscalculic or having maths learning difficulties is very different from test to test. So this is from a Butterworth article, and there are many reasons for students having maths difficulties, and it looks like the standard tests are actually confounding these difficulties. So we need to properly characterize dyscalculia, not using these kind of average normed tests. If it has a genetic cause, and we suggest it may well, given that it is there in birth, then it's likely to affect the basic numerical capacities, and the tests need to focus on these. Often these other tests don't focus on core number abilities, they focus on the acquired or the cultural number abilities. So in our Melbourne longitudinal study then, we were looking to see whether or not we could find indicators of dyscalculia in terms of these core number abilities. And we traced the evolution of maths ability in 267 students starting at prep and going all the way through 7 years through to grade 6. And there is an article reference there for you on where this is published. And the first thing we measured was basic number competency. This is core number ability that I've talked about several times. So enumeration, estimation, non-verbal computation, and counting. These sorts of skills really are part of our basic toolkit for progressing into any other arithmetic processing. And then we looked at these applied number competencies, so reading and writing numbers and single digit addition. We need to know not only can we characterize basic problems in number, but do they have an impact? If they don't have an impact, then it doesn't matter so much. But if they are impacting students' future predicting their arithmetic performance on reading and writing numbers and single digit addition, then it's an important aspect of their school lives that we need to address. And the other thing we needed to do was to look at just general cognitive abilities. We need to know that this problem, dyscalculia, isn't just some kind of a general cognitive problem, a problem with IQ, a problem with working memory, a problem with basic reaction time or executive function. So remember in video 1, I did say what subitizing was, but I reiterate it here because it becomes critical in going through this data. When children and adults are asked to identify the number of dots in a visual array, they typically enumerate small arrays, those are with less than or equal to 4 dots, rapidly and accurately, and are slower and more error-prone in enumerating the larger arrays. The apparent automaticity with which we can enumerate small dot arrays has been termed subitizing. So dot enumeration then, we would present 1 to 8 dots randomly, and this is the sort of profile that we get. Now the y-axis here, the vertical axis, is a time measure. Mostly with dot counting, students can count them and get the right answer. But what we're interested in is how long do they take? And you can see here that this function starts quite flat and then goes into a greater angle. And I just want to caution about what happens at 7 and 8. It looks as though they're subitizing again at 7 and 8. Students quite quickly learn when you're presenting lots of repeats of these dots that the largest number of dots is 8. And so what they do is after a while they start to answer very quickly for 8 just because they can see it's a large number of dots. So you need to really consider that graph up to 7. And in fact, some of our studies now we present dots up to 9 so that we can cut off 9 and get the accurate function. And then we have symbolic number comparison, where we're looking at the numerals 1 to 9 and we're asking students to say which is larger. And note again the amount of variability that we're finding in this profile. Now, again, it's reaction time, and you can see that they're getting slower as the ratio increases. And I will describe in video 4 how we calculate this ratio. Essentially, the higher the ratio, the closer together the two numbers are. So they get slower as the numbers get closer together, but we have a great deal of variability. So what we need to look at now are these individual differences. We think that these individual differences are going to give us information about delay, deficit, and the typical function. And that is why we need to look at these individual differences, not via a cutoff, where we might think of dyscalculia as you either have it or you don't. It's very much we want to look at profiles of performance so we can see the nature of the learning difficulties. So we're suggesting then that there is a real significance in these individual differences in terms of indexing learning difficulties like dyscalculia and also different developmental pathways. So it's very informative for us in how students develop their maths abilities. So let's briefly return to this issue of performance variability, and those are the two graphs for dot enumeration and symbolic number comparison. What we're interested in is whether or not that variability is showing a systematic different groups. So for instance, is there a group that's at the bottom of that range all the way, so the fastest? And is there another group that's at the top, the slowest? Or is it that in fact is just randomly distributed and variability doesn't have any systematicity at all? And similarly with number comparison. So why are we interested in dot enumeration and number comparison though? And of course, the reason we're interested in it is because it has been shown to be a core number abilities, but very little research has actually investigated whether the failure to subitize, or to subitize slowly, or to subitize to a very narrow span, is associated with other deficiency later, another number deficiencies. So we are strongly advocating that this is a diagnostic way of finding out about and identifying dyscalculia. And so what we were interested in was, were there differences in subitizing ability in 5 to 6 year olds, and were these in any way systematic? That is to say, some students were similar to each other in subitizing ability but different from other groups of students in subitizing ability. And if there are these distinct groups, what is the relationship between these differences and performance on cognitive and maths tasks? And is subitizing speed related to maths and cognitive performance? So, in young children then, there appear to be variation in subitizing speed. We've already shown that. And we also showed in video 1 that at preschoolers we could distinguish between groups. So how do we identify speed profiles? Well, we actually use a different sort of analytical technique called latent class analysis, where latent class analysis can identify in a set of data individuals who are like each other but different from other individuals who in turn are like each other. So we identified these 3 different profiles, and you can see here that there is the length of time is on the upright y-axis, but you can also see that this looks very much like our variability graph, where the top of the bars in the variability graph have come out to be a single group of like students. You can also see from that those students are not subitizing. They are counting pretty much from the beginning. Some are subitizing from 2 to 2 in that group, but most are not subitizing at all. And you can see that in the aqua-colored group that they are subitizing probably to 4 for most of that group. And then we've got what you might describe as the average group in between those. They're 5 to 6 year olds. We would normally expect them to be able to subitize to 3, and that middle group are able to do that. But it's important to note that the profiles didn't differ in terms of the age of the students. It wasn't just that dark red group were older or younger than the other students. They didn't differ in digit span, so it wasn't an issue to do with working memory or short-term memory. And they didn't differ in visuospatial working memory either, that is, memory for how blocks are touched. And they importantly didn't differ in reading comprehension ability. So these groups differ specifically in number, and they differ in a particular way with respect to their subitizing. Now, if you look at the part of the graph which is the counting range, so if you look from 4 to 7 there, you will see that the speed of counting is the same for the rate of the speed of counting is the same. The groups differ in terms of overall time, but the actual rate of getting from one number to another is different, but it is not like that in the subitizing range. And then we looked at reading and writing numbers as a function of these groups that we determined in prep, and we looked to see what happened in grades 1 and 2. Well, the first thing that happened in year 1, you can see that the slow group were only about 28% successful on reading 3-digit numbers. This graph tells us 2 things. It tells us that the groups did differ on their ability to read 3-digit numbers, both at year 1 and at year 2, but you can see the progress that is made by the slow group from year 1 to year 2. So we need to keep that in mind when we're worrying about students with dyscalculia not making progress. They do make progress. The issue is whether they're making progress in the same way as typically developing students. And you can see that they're not too different from the average student in that second year. Similarly with writing numbers, again though, performance generally on writing numbers is lower in years Prep 1 and 2, and you can see again that there were differences. It's also important to note that there were differences in single-digit addition, and also 4 years later, because remember this was a developmental longitudinal study, 4 years later using multi-digit, so 3-digit addition, subtraction, multiplication, the students' groups did differ at that point. So there was a great deal of impact of this subitizing ability on performance later. Now, do dot enumeration differences extend into adulthood, or is this just something that happens in school? We were interested in this, so we took 88 adults. They were aged from 18 to 61, and we just applied this same dot enumeration test, counting dots up to 8. And what we found was almost exactly the same. So yes, it does extend into adults. Adults are much faster overall, but we had these distinct groups, and you can see there in the blue group, they are not subitizing. So this prevalence rate does extend to adulthood, and of course in the video we saw an individual adult with subitizing difficulty and problems. Now I want to mention Lucy, who was part of this All in the Mind program. Lucy was referred to us a number of years ago now because her teachers said she really was not processing number at all well, and they didn't understand what was happening with Lucy. So we tested Lucy using our tests that we've devised from this longitudinal study. And Lucy probably has one of the purest forms of dyscalculia we've ever witnessed. On dot enumeration, she had a linear increasing function. She had no subitizing whatever. She counted dots at 2. And Lucy also showed poor performance on other indicators of basic core number ability, like the number comparison task, although she was average and above average in working memory and processing speed. But importantly, Lucy was an extremely able student. She was fluent in several languages. Her 2 parents were speaking 2 different languages, French and Italian. She spoke fluently in French to one of her parents, fluently in Italian to the other, fluently in English to me. And so she had her school performance generally was very high, but she had this specific difficulty with number processing. And I worked with Lucy for a while, and we were working particularly on equivalent fractions, which were mentioned. We talked about fractions in video 2. And we were working with flip cards, and for a considerable amount of time Lucy had no idea what to do with these flip cards. Eventually though, in one session she suddenly had this breakthrough, and she suddenly understood all about equivalent fractions, and she could work with these flip cards, and then she was able to work on the whiteboard. And when her parents came to pick her up, we were so excited to show her parents how well she had suddenly got the idea of equivalent fractions. And I was feeling very relieved that we'd really overcome this hurdle, and Lucy was going to be able to move on. When Lucy came back for a session the following week, it was as if she had never heard of equivalent fractions. And the reason for that is likely that she suddenly realized what the process was in order to do equivalent fractions, but because she didn't have a conceptual understanding of what that process was about, she didn't then manage to remember it a week later when she'd had a whole week of her life and the exciting things that happen for 9-year-olds. And her lack of number sense seemed to result in her not having any sense of the relationship between numbers. So she didn't know that 30 was less than 40, and when I asked her once, how would you get from 37 to 38? What would you need to add? She had no idea. She was frustrating in some sense, but exciting in others, because she did make progress, and that was exciting. But if you said to her, what do you picture when I say to you 27? And she says, I picture a 2 and a 7. And that is exactly how students with dyscalculia are imagining numbers. They're not imagining it in relation to the understanding of number that we need. So this then leads us directly into assessing students for specific number difficulties, and in particular for dyscalculia, the focus of video 4. But before we do that, let's just summarize what's happened in videos 1 to 3. We've highlighted a wide range of maths abilities that students are expected to acquire through formal schooling, the capabilities they had entering school, and the wide range of difficulties that can occur along the way. We've drawn attention to different developmental pathways and the importance of recognizing the wide range of students' maths performance. In video 3, I've focused on a specific type of maths learning difficulty, dyscalculia, which is qualitatively different from other maths learning difficulties. Dyscalculia has a neurological underpinning, and that impacts the complete range of maths processing. So in the final 2 videos then, we will cover ways to assess maths learning difficulties and intervention strategies to support MLD students in successfully accessing the maths curriculum.